PM, it's still not signed off on by everyone. We just heard the WA Premier Colin Barnett adamant that he won't relinquish 30% of WA's GST. Does Western Australia warrant a special deal to get it on board?
Well, as I said, I've got to know Colin quite well over the last a year or so that he's been Premier. We work well on a whole range of matters. I'm confident that we'll find some way through on this one. But I'd also just say this very clearly. You see, for the system to work for the future, whereby the Australian government becomes the dominant funder of the system for the long-term future, it's simply being transparent up front about the role we've taken on our shoulders to take this 1/3 of the GST and dedicate it to a National Hospitals Fund now. That is what this is about. That's the reality. Rather than using some form of accounting window dressing to pretend it's not the reality. That's the reality.
That's the reality they're frightened of. Colin Barnett says he won't buy into that. His biggest beef seems to be that Western Australia only receives, as it is, 68 cents for every dollar WA generates in terms of GST. Is the answer to this impasse, for instance, a renegotiation of the Commonwealth Grant Commission's GST funding formula so WA gets a bigger share of that pie?
I just note for the record that just prior to the Commonwealth Grants Commission producing its report a little while ago on the distribution of other revenues across the states and territories, that the WA Treasurer, Treasurer Buswell, said that this report should be implemented lock, stock and barrel. That's what they said. Then it came down, produced some numbers which were somewhat more adverse for Western Australia as they saw it, and then suddenly the tune changed. I think what happens with Commonwealth Grants Commission reports when they come down is that people tend to change their tune depending on the result it actually delivers. I've said more broadly, however, that we need to work with the states and territories to ensure that they get the most secure form of funding base for the long-term future. I'm very conscious of the infrastructure needs right across the nation, in particular in the resource states, where you've got huge demands additionally on infrastructure to support the massive expansion of mining projects. So we'll continue to work this through with the West, but on the fundamentals of this reform deal on health and hospitals, Fran, I'd just say we're being upfront about what's happening here. The Australian government's becoming a dominant funder. We've got 1/3 on average of the GST going directly now for the first time in the country's history into a National Hospitals Fund. That's the way it's to be for the future, for us to be the dominant funder of the system. We, the Australian government, becoming those responsible for most of the growth for the long-term future in the system. We're just being upfront about it, as opposed to deploying a bit of an accounting trick to pretend that somehow the state receiving the tax from us and then the state sending it back to us is somehow a whole lot different to that. I think it's far better that we're just upfront and transparent about what's happening here.
Premier Barnett seemed to indicate that he thinks you've got you over a bit of a barrel because he doesn't think you can have a national agreement, not to mention a change to the intergovernmental agreement on the GST if one state holds out. Can you deliver all this promised reforms to 7 out of the 8 states and territories, or do you need everyone?
Let's be very clear about it. On this question, Colin's just wrong. We currently have at least 2 intergovernmental agreements which don't include Western Australia in other areas of government. This is fortified by advice from all the agencies of the Australian government. So that argument which he put forward yesterday is just wrong as a matter of fact. Secondly, I am, however, confident that we will find a way through with Western Australia and the government there, because the people of Western Australia have real problems in their health system. They need more doctors, they need more nurses. I was speaking recently to the Nurses Federation of Western Australia. There are crying needs right across their system. They have problems with accident and emergency, they have problems with elective surgery, and what we have on the table for WA for the decade ahead is an additional investment of in excess of about $2.4 billion. And for the 3 or 4 years ahead, about $500 million to add those extra doctors, to add those extra hospital beds, to add those extra places for aged care and for mental health services. So I think it's very important that we get beyond a debate about accounting tricks and get on with the business of delivering those services on the ground to the long-suffering people of the West.
It's 10 minutes to 8 on RM Breakfast. Our guest this morning is the Prime Minister in our Parliament House studio. Prime Minister, all these extra beds, all this taking the pressure off the emergency wards and the elective surgery lists, how are you going to pay for that? Should Australians expect deep and historic cuts in the federal budget?
What we've said all along is that if we bring about this fundamental reform for the future, there would be no blank cheque to the states. That is, if we were to take onto our shoulders the dominant funding role for the health and hospital system for the future, then it meant that there had to be a transfer of a proportion of existing state revenues. That is what we have done with the transfer of 1/3 of the GST to a National Hospitals Fund to be part of the funding base for the long-term needs of the National Health and Hospital System. That's very clear.
What about the short-term $5 billion,
Sure.
though?
I'll come to that in a minute. So let's be very clear. We've said that there is no free money here. It had to be based on this fundamental transfer, which is a very deep change in the way in which we've funded the health and hospital system for the future. Secondly, for growth over the next 3 to 4 years, obviously that is something that we will meet within our own budgetary parameters and within the disciplines that we've put forward for the budget for the period ahead. We will maintain fiscal discipline. We have put this entire reform package through the Budget Committee of the Cabinet. We will do so within the disciplines that we have previously announced, which will govern the budget. We believe this can be done in an entirely responsible fashion. And I would again simply contrast that with my political opponent, Mr Abbott, who, when he was Health Minister for nearly 5 years, his achievement on health and hospitals was to gouge $1 billion out of the public hospital system and to freeze GP training places. That's not the way in which Australians want to see their services in health and hospitals done for the future.
And just finally, Prime Minister, talking about your political opponent, Tony Abbott, there is a suggestion that he might go one better. He might take up the notion of 100% funding by the Commonwealth of Health and Hospitals. Could steal your thunder at the next election. Would you be prepared to match him?
Well, Mr Abbott has both ruled in and ruled out practically every position possible on health and hospitals reform over the last period of time that he's been Leader of the Opposition and during the period in which he was Health Minister of Australia for 5 years. I'll just say this, 12 years of Howard government, 5 years in which Mr Abbott was himself Health Minister. He said back then that the Australian government should take over the system. He failed to act. He's both supported and opposed practically every element of what we've put forward. I notice that Mr Abbott, through his health spokesman, has come out and opposed this reform plan and this investment plan by the Australian government for the future. Can I just appeal to Mr Abbott directly and to make clear, absolutely clear today, that he will not use his numbers in the Senate to block a further element of health and hospitals reform. He's already opposed a key source of funding for the future of the system. That's the $2 billion we stand to lose by him insisting on his own position on private health insurance for the wealthiest Australians, like him and like me. We need to get that done in order to properly fund health and hospitals for the future. But my direct challenge to Mr Abbott today, given that he's come out already through his spokesman and opposed our reform plan and our funding plan, is to make clear whether he will use his numbers in the Senate to block or oppose what we are putting forward as the biggest health reform plan in Australia since the introduction of Medicare.
Prime Minister, thank you very much for joining us on Breakfast.
Thanks for having us on the program.